Well, gender roles and gender stereotypes this week. A fascinating subject and certainly timely, and so much new material and information and openness about this subject. So I'm very glad this chapter is included in this newer text that I'm using. So let's talk about gender roles first. Gender roles are the society's expectations of people's behavior and attitudes based on biological sex, whether that's female or male. Now, one of the really important things to understand about this whole discussion is that gender is cultural and sex is biological. Gender has to do with what that definition just said, the roles and expectations that a particular culture has around what it means to be male or female. Okay. And then sex is the biological chromosomal aspect of the whole thing. So there are some pretty powerful researches and stories and understandings about all of this. And a big part to understand is the argument between nature and nurture, the influence of nature versus nurture on gender expression. How much is biology? How much is socialization? That's what nature versus nurture means. Nurture is the socialization that we receive, those expectations and roles and how our parents treat us and all of that versus the biology. Okay. So one of the first things to understand is that all fetuses are female initially, okay? And up through, I think it's about the six to 7 weeks, okay? I'll just read this to you out of a research site. During early development, the gonads of the fetus remain undifferentiated. That is, all fetal genitalia are the same and are phenotypically female. After approximately 6 to 7 weeks of gestation, however, the expression of a gene on the Y chromosome induces changes that result in the development of the testes. So here's a key point to understand, and it has to do with the higher mortality rate of male, both fetuses and babies. And part of that is because a female fetus doesn't have to go through a process of the Y chromosome manifesting at 6 to 7 weeks and all those complex changes that occur, okay? But a male fetus does have to go through that process. Whenever there's more processes and the more complicated they are, the more potential there is for things to possibly go wrong or not work exactly as they should. So that's one thing to understand. So so as you know, females XX, males XY chromosomes. There is such thing as a double Y chromosome for males, and we will talk about that in a minute here. But first, I want to give you an example of 2 studies that were done specifically one was an accidental study. The first one I'm going to tell, but a very famous research. And then the second one was an actual study. So the first one is the famous story and horribly disturbing one of David/Brenda. So David was one of 2 twin boys that were born in, I think it was the 60s. I'm going to see if I have this written down. No, I don't, unfortunately. a while ago, anyway. And I'm also going to put up, there's some documentaries about David Brenda, so that I'll put up on the in the class. So let me just see if I can find, no, because I didn't put it down. Okay. So these two twin boys were circumcised, I think it was, I forget, it was longer than we normally think about that being. Wasn't right at birth. It was, I'm thinking 17, 18 days or something they were saying. And the way they did that then was with a hot needle. Well, went fine with one of the twin boys, the circumcision, but did not with David, and the doctor actually burned the baby's penis off. So then they went through this whole horror. You could imagine how horrible that would be. And it was decided with the medical professionals that the best thing to do is turn David into a girl. Okay. So very early on, they did some physical surgery to, create a vagina, and then they also gave David hormones at a certain point, and David was never told. They changed the name to Brenda. Never told what had happened or what occurred or any of that. And the interesting thing is, when you read this research and see some of the documentary stuff, and you can do, and if you just do David Brenda online, a Google search, you'll come up with more than I was able to put up for you, just because of space. But the mother was in this kind of weird denial place where, she's so girly and she just loves to dress up and all that. Well, in the meantime, Brenda was urinating standing up in grammar school as a girl. And of course, you can imagine how that went down. So a lot of acting out, a lot of depression. At puberty, they were going to do the, really huge hormone boost to female hormones. And finally, I think it was the father told Brenda the truth. He was really a biological male, as it happened, blah, blah, they'd done all of this. Then they did reverse sex change operations. Brenda Brenda turned back into David. He married when he was, late 20s, early 30s, I believe. The woman he married had a couple of kids that came to the marriage with her, and he wound up committing suicide in his early 30s, I think it was. So nature versus, this is an example where the nature side of the argument seems to win, right? They did everything they possibly could to make David into a female, and it with horrible consequences did not work out. Now I'm going to give you one that is more of a socialization or a nurture side, and that's the Vietnam vet study. When all these men came back from the Vietnam War, 4,462 of them were at some huge camp where they deprocessed them and all of that sort of thing. And they decided to do a lot of physical testing with them, blood work and things, because they had them there and they couldn't go anywhere, and it was a great opportunity to do it. And it was a multidisciplinary team of doctors, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists. If not, this never would have been discovered. So what they found in the Vietnam vet study, you can also find that online, is that men with higher testosterone levels had higher incidences of, they went clear back in their records to high school, and I think even junior high at some point, to acting out, getting in trouble, getting kicked out of school, getting expelled, getting in trouble with police, more incidents of domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse, getting in fights, Not good stuff, right? So one could then draw the conclusion, oh, okay, it's nature, and that high levels of testosterone just physically there's cause and effect with these behaviors. Well, here's what's interesting. Not all men with very high testosterone levels in the study had that behavior. There was a percentage of them that did not. The majority did. But there was a group of them, a significant enough number, that they got interested in what caused that. And this is where the sociologists and the anthropologists got in on it. It turns out, now you may believe it or not believe it, it was social class and education. Okay. So those men actually tended maybe to be officers. They did very well. They were sometimes overachievers, whatever. They weren't acting out in the negative ways that the rest of the men in the study with high testosterone levels were. And they were socialized to say, no, it's not okay to hit women. You got to be polite to women and open doors for them. And then in their, it just wasn't acceptable behavior to act out in those ways. They came from families where they were expected to do well in school. They were expected to go to college, et cetera, et cetera. So that nature is a nurture, because it was nurture, i.e. socialization, that mitigated the effects of what was manifesting in the other men with high testosterone levels. So it's a very, very complex issue. But I will tell you this, that 90% of social scientists are going to tell you that much of it is socialization. That is generally socialization, nurture, has a stronger influence than biology. But, there are plenty of people who disagree with that. I'm just telling you from a social science perspective. So that's the David Brenda film I'm going to put up, and the Vietnam vet study. There's also another nature one, which is called Klinefelter syndrome, which is men who have a double Y chromosome. And you can look this up online too. They did a very interesting study with prisoners. And there tend to be more men in prison than in the general population with Klinefelter syndrome, with the double Y chromosome. Okay. But here's where we get into the nature-nurture thing. Okay. So does the double Y chromosome cause violent behavior and get you wound up in prison? Well, there's plenty of men walking around in the world, not in prison, with a double Y chromosome. The percentage is not as high as men in prison with it. But the fact that there are plenty of men who are not violent, who have a Y chromosome, who have this syndrome, how much is nature? How much is nurture? Once again, it's such an interesting concept to think about, particularly with the gender fluidity that we have today. To think about nature versus nurture and those issues. So the key point here is that gender is a social construct. And it varies so dramatically from culture to culture. We'll get into that a little bit. So, and that this idea that male and female behavior is not created by biology so much as by how society expects us to behave based on what biological sex we are. And once again, I'll give you some examples in a bit of cultures where those expectations are very different than our expectations. So we learn those expectations as we develop our gender identity and our beliefs about ourselves as male or female. So here's an example of a very famous study. Margaret Mead, the mother of anthropology in America, did a study in the 1930s. She went to New Guinea And the title of the book is Sex and Temperament in Three Cultures. The three cultures she studied were tribal cultures in New Guinea: the Arapesh, the Mundungamur, and the Chambuli. And here's what she found out. Mead found a different pattern of male and female behaviors in each of the cultures she studied, all different from gender role expectations in the United States at that time. Why she did this research is this is what she wanted to know. Is male and female behavior hardwired, or is it socialized by society? So she found that no, it's not necessarily hardwired, because here's these three cultures that are very different from what we think of in the United States as male and female behavior. So she found among the Arapesh a temperament for both males and females, both, that was gentle, responsive, and cooperative. Those adjectives are all applied primarily to females in our Western society. Rarely do you hear someone describe a man as gentle, responsive, and cooperative, right? But both males and females were in this culture, the Arapesh. Among the Mundungamur, who are now called the Biwat, by the way, both males and females were violent and aggressive, seeking power and position. The other thing, because this isn't the whole book, is that Arapesh, both males and females, did equal amounts of childcare, were loving with the babies. Men played for hours with the babies, carried them around with them on their backs like the women did, et cetera, et cetera. In the Mundungamur, the poor babies could barely survive because nobody paid much attention to them. The women didn't like to nurse them. Nobody was cuddling and coddling them. No wonder they grew up, right, to be violent, aggressive, angry people. And seeking power and position, highly competitive, right? Just survival was a competition for babies and children in that culture, because nobody was really loving them or nurturing them or taking care of them, okay? And for the Chambuli, now the Chambri, male and female temperaments were distinct from each other. However, it was the woman who was the dominant, impersonal, and managerial, and the male was less responsible and more emotionally dependent. Okay. You rarely hear the term emotionally dependent applied to males. You rarely hear the term dominant, impersonal, and managerial applied to females in our culture, right? But that's what was happening in this particular culture of the Chambuli. So we have these stereotypes and these concepts, but they're very much socially constructed, or to a great extent, they're socially constructed. So you think about gender stereotypes and just pink and blue. Where the heck did that come from, right? That was not true. I think I mentioned this previously. When I was younger and having babies, and certainly when I was a baby, I've talked to my mother about it at one point. There wasn't this dichotomy between colors for boys and colors for girls. They were kind of pastel-y colors, but they were all colors in general for babies in general. So there's attitudes and expectations about gender roles that are not necessarily based on inherent natural biological gender differences, but on gender stereotypes. And we're very strong and powerful with that in our culture. We have very, very dichotomous and powerful gender stereotypes in Western culture. So they're oversimplified ideas about traits and behaviors and patterns and attitudes that some are male and some are female. Okay. So, the poem, little boys are made of snips and snails and puppy dog tails, and little girls are made of all those sugar and spice and everything that's nice. I mean, that poem's been around for generations, and it kind of says it all in a way. So we make assumptions based on gender. Primary school teachers are just a picture that comes to mind if you talk about your second grade teacher or your kindergarten teacher. They're women, right? Or preschool teacher. Now, by the time you get to high school and certainly to college, where males predominate, it's a different story. But the younger the kid is, the more likely the teacher, even in an institutional setting, is the stereotype is that she's a female, or as they point out, if you talk about a teenage babysitter, the assumption is that it's a female. There aren't too many male teenage babysitters. There are some, but there aren't that, that's certainly not the stereotype is the point, okay? And here's another very interesting thing that I don't know if you've thought about this, but I've thought about it for years, and I used to talk about it in the classroom, is that women can cross gender barriers in many ways much more acceptably and easily in the West. You don't want to do that in the Muslim culture, but in the West, we can do that much more easily and more acceptably than males crossing into female stereotypical behaviors, etc. If you look at hate crimes and I think male homosexuals are the second or third after race biggest targets of hate crimes in the United States. There aren't too many lesbians. There was a famous case of, and I think it was in Oregon or Northern California years ago, of two lesbians being murdered. But it's very few and far between and small compared to the hostility to males crossing into female territory. And I'll give you an example. Although we're not in a classroom, I would always say in a classroom, look around at how you're all dressed. 90% of the women usually in a classroom, in a modern classroom, are, at least at SWAC, are dressed in clothes that men could wear. They're male clothes, They're pants and a sweatshirt, pants and a shirt, t-shirt, whatever, depending on the weather, right? Now, no one thinks twice about that, and I didn't either till I started lecturing on this stuff. I noticed it, thinking, okay, no one pays any attention to that. What if a man or a couple of men were sitting around in dresses and skirts or something much, much more feminine? Would be very different, wouldn't it? Everybody's reactions would be different. It would be, for one thing, it would be noticeable. We don't even notice that women are wearing androgynous clothing, okay? So there's that. The threat of, and as I said, the threat of punishment and harassment and violence is much stronger for males stepping into female behaviors than the reverse. And I wanted to tell you a funny thing about a psychological testing. It says to tell you the psychological testing story. So many years ago, I was in Seattle looking for work, looking for a job, applying for jobs. And one of them was for a psychological testing company that sold their tests to potential employers. And of course, they weren't going to hire me without giving me their test. So I took it, duly took the test. And when I sat down with the person from the testing company, he said, this is really interesting, because if I didn't know that you were a female from having interviewed me and my name on the test and that type of thing, he said, by your answers, I would have thought you were a male. He said, you have a male brain. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because nobody's ever told me that before. I never thought about it. I never had a psychological test, of that nature before. So if that's true, whatever, it's been of a benefit to me. But what if I'd been a male and they said, you know what, you got a female brain? And who knows what their tests and their, the cognition that once again, see the stereotypes that are assumed to be, whatever questions I answered, the way I answered them were more likely the way a male would answer them. So, and I, I'm pretty determined in my opinions and fairly assertive about them. So that was probably what happened. I didn't equivocate. Maybe there was an option to say, I don't know, or something, and I didn't mark those. Who knows what it was? But whatever the assumptions were based on stereotypes of male and female brains. Okay, I thought that was a funny story. So socialization and gender. Who are the agents of socialization? Well, they're, the first are family, and the most powerful ones are family. And certainly school and peers and religion and the media are all also very powerful socializers, agents of socialization. The family, it begins before infancy. Now, and I think I talked about this previously too. With ultrasound and amniocentesis, we know the sex of the baby before it's born. So you can start socializing them into gender before they're born already by what color you paint the nursery, which is why I hate to repeat myself, but it's an appropriate time to, why people, when you ask them why they want to know the sex of the baby before it's born, it's for those very reasons. How to decorate the nursery, what kind of shower gifts, those types of things. So can you see how you're already socializing pre-birth babies into sexual roles and what's normal for a particular sex? And the parents don't even know they're doing this, as they point out. But many studies have documented this process. Parents describe their infant daughters as pretty and soft and delicate, and their sons as strong and alert and active. Well, when they do the research with strangers and the strangers don't know what sex the baby is, nobody sees that in those babies based on their gender. It's the parents who see it, and the parents who are kind of creating that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So can you see when that doesn't work, that self-fulfilling prophecy? The drama around a kid who doesn't behave in these stereotypical ways that a parent has assumed that they do. Okay. So also, parents play very differently with male and female children, as your book points out. They're more gentle with girl babies, and quietly. They play more quiet things with them. Boys, they tend to throw up in the air and catch and do a little bit of gentle wrestling. When a baby cries, if it's a female baby, they're warmly comforted often, and boys, the research shows they let them cry longer, and they comfort them. Parents comfort them less. Certainly toys are huge. Boys, action figures, girls, and I think, well, if boys have action figures, what do girls have? In-action figures? I mean, baby dolls you do a lot of things with them. In a way, you might do more. You feed them, you change their clothes, you hold them, you cuddle them, you put them in your doll crib, whatever, But they're thought of as being very passive. And the play, I guess, is certainly more passive than with boys' action figures, which, let's get real, are war figures, right? They're G.I. Joes and things of that nature. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies. Mary Catherine Bateson, who was the daughter of the great anthropologist Gregory Bateson and researcher, she married someone from the Middle East and lived in the Middle East for a while, and she did some research there. So one of the things she did was she visited with Middle Eastern moms and their young babies about crawling age, and the moms didn't know that she was studying how they were behaving, but she was, and she wrote a paper about it. What she observed was that, and they sat on the floor, of course, in Middle Eastern cultures, so they would be sitting on the floor, they'd be having tea or talking, visiting Mary Catherine Bateson and the mom and the baby. And the boy babies just crawled on their own all over the room without any, restrictions at all. But the girl babies Mary Catherine Bateson said they got, 12 to 18 inches beyond the mother's body, and the mom would pull them back in to her, and try and hold them on her lap or whatever until they got restless, and then she'd let them crawl, and they'd start crawling off, wandering, exploring, and she'd pull them back to her. When she got back to the US, she did further research, and part of that research was moms with crawlers or toddlers. No, it was mostly just crawlers, I think, playing with their babies. And the moms thought that the researchers were studying the baby's behavior, but they were studying the mom's behavior. What they would do was they would give the mom and the baby on the floor again, sitting on the floor, a toy to play with. And the baby would play with the toy, the baby and mom would play with the toy. And then they told the mom, take the toy and go put it across the room, and then come back and sit with the baby. And here's what happened. The boy babies, the mom would say, in both cases, the babies would start fussing, reaching towards the toy, they want the toy, right? Made it very clear. With boy babies, the mom would say, hey, Johnny, you can get it. You're a big boy. Crawl over there and encourage him, just like, I guess, like we do dogs when we're training them to retrieve something. Go on, you can do it. All this encouragement to move out, to explore, and get what you need and for yourself. What do you think they did with the girl babies? They got up and went and got the toy for the girl baby and brought it back to her. Not 100% each one, but the significant percentages treated boy babies and girl babies differently in that respect. People also tend to carry boy babies once their heads are stable enough, facing outward. Okay. Well, when you're carried facing outward, you have, it's called instrumental. The stereotypical description of males and females is that men are instrumental, women are emotional. In motive, not emotional like crying and stuff, but emotive, are connected with their emotions. Males are connected with making things happen, instrumental. And so if you're very young and you're primarily your exposure is outward, you can touch, you can see, you can grab, you can feel, you can kick. If girl babies are carried inward more, and they are, that our famous women's intuition, think how early we learn differences in tone of voice, heart rates, body temperature. If someone's agitated or not, you can pick all those things up if that is what your awareness is on, your closeness is on. So it's quite interesting to think. And parents don't know they're doing this. That's the whole key point here. So peers certainly are very interesting in how that gets related to with gender. Boys and girls play different kinds of games. So it's primarily sports related, competitive, with lots of rules. All sports have different rules that you have to abide by, and inflexible roles. You're a first baseman, or you're a pitcher, whatever. They have formal roles. Whereas girls tend to play more small cooperative games. They play house, which is extremely cooperative. And even hopscotch and jump rope is not highly competitive. They're just, it's more about having fun. Sometimes the jump ropes, there's two girls on either end of the rope and you jump in the middle. That's cooperative, that type of thing. Girls do play more sports now, certainly, very much so, but the differences are still apparent. It's interesting with the research, with girls playing many more sports than they used to. The competitiveness is what's primary in boys sports, whereas cooperation tends to be what's primary in girls sports. And boys, as we know, this right, we talked about moving from one stereotypical behavior to another as male and female and gender. Boys who are not competitive are often called sissies and made fun of, and that type of thing. And so the patterns that we manifest as males and females that we just think are natural and normal as adults have their roots in our childhood and so many levels of socialization. Schools is another one. Schools are a major agent of socialization. We spend more of our waking hours in school than we do at home. And when we get older, it's at work than we do at home. And and we do it for 12 years plus, depending on when we start, if we're in preschool or not. So playgrounds are great places for research to look at gender-based activities in playgrounds. But more importantly, even than that, is that teachers at all levels of education pay more attention to male students than to female students. They treat males and females differently. They call on boys more often in class. They praise them more when they give the right answer, and they give more feedback on assignments, about assignments. And that, as I said, occurs at all grade levels. And also textbooks and other books in schools, they're better, but there's still a lot of gender stereotypes in those books. The newer ones, much less so, but you can still find them. So what about mass media? Oh boy, there's a real major socialization into gender. The research done on children's TV shows that most of the characters are male. You can think of Sesame Street about that, and then the text talks about SpongeBob SquarePants. But this is true of adult movies and television shows as well. Okay, and women are often portrayed as kind of, bubbleheads, unintelligent, frivolous. They care more about their looks than anything else. That's very common. Not as, once again, it's getting better, much better than in my generation, but still there. And TV commercials certainly reinforce all of that. For women, it's other than for both sexes, there's so many prescription ads. But outside of those, it's cosmetics for women. Cleaning products are huge. So what is the message in that? Your role is to be beautiful and keep a clean house, right? That's basically what the underlying subliminal messages are there. Magazines, certainly for teens and adult women, reinforce those gender images of being super skinny, or the beautiful models. They involve advice on dieting and not just advice, but also ads, dieting, cosmetics, how to win and please men. For boys and men's magazines, the articles and ads tend to be about cars, sports, how to succeed in careers, and alongside pictures of thin, gorgeous women's, either semi-nude and sometimes nude. So what these images do is they suggest that women's, main role is to please, and to please, of course, men. Men's main role is to succeed, win over women, and live life in the fast lane, the fast cars and that type of thing. You may not have thought about religion being a major agent of socialization, but indeed it is. And there's some research there that supports that in your text. And it's especially powerful about gender stereotypes. So I want you to know that this began before even traditional interpretations of the Bible, going back pre-Christian and even Judeo-Christian religions. There, were some very powerful cultures that repressed women. There were also ones that recognized that had plenty of goddesses along with gods, and that was part of the whole Judeo-Christian process, was stamping out earth goddess-based religions. So once this all happened, then the ethos became that women are subservient to men. These are literal statements in the Old Testament. Okay, women are subservient to men. Look at our foundational story of Genesis, and Adam and Eve. And Eve, it was made as a helpmeet for Adam, created second, out of his, the story. Okay, so major figures in the Bible are men. If there are women, they're wives, mothers, temptresses, and prostitutes, and they're kind of few and far between. And when they are there, they're praised for their roles as wives and mothers and condemned for their other roles. But I want to point out that, part of what the Old Testament is talking about in Babel and other cultures was the fact that they were goddess worshiping. They were pagan, goddess worshiping cultures. By the way, pagan means rural in the country, which is where those indigenous earth-based religions lasted the longest before they were completely wiped out. So women are in the Bible more generally depicted as the property of men. Maiden, I wanted to talk to you about that, the property of men. I've mentioned this before. I think our maiden names, and think about that, maiden is a virgin, right? Our maiden names before we marry are our father's names. That identifies us, how that began, the origins of that. It doesn't in the modern world. I want you to understand the origins. We were our father's property. When we marry, then we take our husband's last name, generally, still today, which the property shifted. That's the walking down the aisle, the giving away, okay? So that all started with the concept of women as being property of men. The Ten Commandments includes, includes the neighbor's wife with the house, the oxen, and other objects that you're not supposed to covet. And there, in the Old Testament, there's several passages that justify the rape and murder of women and girls. And the Quran, certainly in Islam, has passages asserting the subordination of women. So what's the logical conclusion of that if you believe those things? Well, the obvious conclusion is that religious people should believe in traditional gender roles and views more than less religious people. Well, guess what? Research supports that. Religious people do believe in traditional gender roles more than less religious people, more religious people. So there's a survey in there, general social science survey, that shows that the frequency of prayer, how often people pray. So and this statement: it is much better for everyone involved if the man is the achiever outside the home and the woman takes care of the home and family. The more often people pray, from the research, the more likely they are to agree with that statement, that the man should be the achiever outside the home and the woman takes care of the home and family. Okay, so very clear distinction in gender roles there. What about gender identity and gender expression? Well, gender identity is your own subjective experience of your own gender and how it develops. Obviously, as I said in the very beginning of this, that's a topic of a lot of debate. And the extent to which one identifies with a particular gender is that gender identity. That's what that means. So your individual sense and subjective experience of being a man, a woman, or somewhere in between on that continuum of male versus female. It's a continuum. Okay? And that gender identity is often shaped very early in life. And what it primarily consists of is the acceptance or non-acceptance of your membership, your personal identity, your feeling of membership in a particular gender category, which for most kids, what you get for a category is two to choose from, right? Generally, early in socialization. So in most, that's what I was just saying, in most societies, that division it's not just American societies, in most societies, that basic division of gender attributes is assigned to either males or females. But in all societies, there are some individuals who don't conform or identify with the gender norms that are assigned to them through their biological sex. So the two spirits in Native American cultures who manifest male and female energy and who often change their gender and operate as, it's more common for males in Native American cultures to operate as females than the reverse, but it's both, and it's called two spirits, and they are honored, not denigrated, right? Hdfs in India, there's a whole bunch of examples around the world of folks who say, even in indigenous cultures, no, I'm not, that's not who I am. I don't have a gender identity that is the same as yours. It's different. It's anomalous in the culture. And in some cultures, as I just said, that's accepted. In others, it's not. We're getting better in the West, aren't we? But it was very difficult for many, many, many hundreds of years for people. So Western terminologies that we have now, you're probably familiar with them. You're younger than I am, so you're maybe much more familiar with them than I am. But cisgender is what we used to call heterosexual, right? It's those who identify with gender that corresponds with the sex assigned to them at birth. Transgender, those are folks who identify with a gender that is different than their biological sex. So a male identifies as female, or a female identifies as male. Some transgendered people, obviously, as you know, choose either hormonal therapies or surgical sex change operations, as David had both, as we talked about earlier. So gender queer, gender fluid, gender variant, androgynous, agender, gender nonconforming. Remember, I said it's a continuum, and there's many different stops along the way. Those terms are used by those who do not identify within that gender binary as either a man or a woman, and they exist somewhere on the continuum. So let's look at the continuum. The continuum is seeing and understanding gender as a continuum, as not just either these two opposite and opposing poles with opposite and opposing characteristics of male and female, but a movement along that line in one direction or the other. That allows for the diversity of genders, and from trans, cis to queer, agender, and all those other terminologies that we had. So most Western societies operate on the idea that gender is binary. It's two, right? Only two genders, men and women, based on two sexes, male and female. If you believe that, if that's your frame of reference and your social construction of gender, then everyone has to be one or the other, right? And what it does is it creates what's called a social dichotomy. So it kind of enforces, and is historically, I know it's changing now, but let's talk about this. It's very new that it's changing to the degree that it is. What a social dichotomy does is it enforces a kind of performance of those behaviors, a performance to masculine and feminine ideals in all aspects of sex and gender. All aspects means in gender identity, in gender expression, and biological sex. So the expectation in most Western societies with this binary thing is that in all three of those, identity, expression, and sex, you're either male or female. Can you see why it was so interesting to me and such a surprise that the psychological test said that I had a male brain? Because man, that doesn't conform to that, does it? To all three areas being, totally female in my case. So what's queer theory? Supporters of queer theory say, wait a minute, that social dichotomy thing, that having to identify as, exclusively male or female, gender identity is not that rigid or static, and it can evolve over a lifetime. And this is a key point. I want to point out to you that most of the women I know today who are lesbians had been wives and mothers sometimes for 20 plus or more years, have children, etc., etc. So that evolved over a lifetime, didn't it? The same, I know many gay men, some who are currently married to one another, who were husbands and fathers. In fact, I know a couple that both were husbands and fathers. Well, they're still fathers. They're still husbands to each other. You get my point. They were in heterosexual relationships for years and had children. So yes, it does change over the lifetime. I mean, one can make an argument that maybe that was always there, whatever. But the fact remains is that we can manifest our gender in many different ways over a lifetime if we choose to or want to. So queer theory developed in response to the limitations in the way in which identities are thought to be like set in stone, right? Defined, stabilized by gay or straight or, of all the other possibilities now that we have. So they constructed queerness as a way to resist that labeling and that idea that your sexual orientation and identity, et cetera, is set in stone. Queer theory doesn't define a specific identity, so it's very difficult to make a simple definition of, quote, queerness, but it's often used to convey an identity that's not rigid, but fluid and changing. There's in your text, and I'm going to put up a link for you in the genderbread person. It's kind of interesting. It's the breakdown of gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex and sexual orientation into different pieces. It's a graphic. There's also something you can read about it. What about transparenting? There's not a lot of visibility. There's more now, but this is a pretty brand new book, and there's still not as much visibility and certainly not a lot of public support for and parenting resources for trans parents. And unfortunately, the courts still often refuse to legally acknowledge roles as mothers or fathers of their children due to biological discrimination. That's still an issue of gender rights that are being worked on, okay? So what about transgender and non-conforming children, of which there are more and more and more, as I'm sure you are aware? Well, since gender identity, this is a quote from your text, gender identity and expression are central to the way we see ourselves and engage in the world around us. This is certainly true of transgender and gender expansive children and teens, for whom family support is absolutely critical. And that's a quote from the Human Rights Campaign in 2019. Transgender issues with children can manifest in a variety of different ways at different times, in different stages in life, and for different individuals. But in most cases, what's called gender dysphoria, which is a condition that is often apparent in early childhood, gender dysphoria. What that means is that the child's behavior is incongruent with and dissatisfaction with the assigned gender. Okay. So their behavior, they're little boys, but their behavior is incongruent with our idea of little boy behavior, right? And they're dissatisfied with that behavior. They don't want to play sports. They'd rather play with dolls, or, that's a very stereotypical example, but you get the point, okay? Many of those children, probably most, experience rejection of some kind, often from their parents, often in attempt to repress and change that behavior, at least initially. And so, because of both being in denial as parents and trying to change that behavior, parents and others are often not aware how very unhappy those children are, how difficult it is for them. So what we know from research is that family acceptance, and I would add here, since many of you are going to be teachers, the acceptance of anybody in their lives, but teachers are pretty powerful figures in children's lives, because once again, we spend so much time with them as children, that family acceptance and acceptance from others predicts an increase in self-esteem, social support, and interestingly, general health status of those children. And acceptance protects against depression, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, and behaviors. So therefore, parents and teachers, again, access to information is crucial. And a safe school climate is crucial, because these children experience so much more stress and anxiety. They often have a desire to transition or display themselves as a different gender, and they can't. In most cases, they can't, which sets up huge amounts of stress and anxiety. So some schools are more accepting. There's certainly more awareness. There's more training about this now. It's much better than it was. But most still are not there yet with dealing with this issue. There is an increased amount of harassment, bullying, indifference of school staff, and anti-gay victimization towards transgender and gender nonconforming youth. So I hope that this chapter is helpful to you if you are moving into a career as someone in the educational field or early childhood development field, and if you're not, as parents, because many or most of you will become parents, and you may be dealing with this issue with your own children. So the more you can learn, the more you can understand, the better off everyone is in this situation. And the good news is that at least people are feeling freer to express who they are. But that always sets up a backlash of some kind, and we're seeing that as well. All right, see you next week.